This video is going to help you out with the last part of Chapter 6 on hormones, homeostasis, and reproduction. Okay, so let's start first by reviewing the definition of homeostasis. So we know homeo means the same, okay? So it's the ability to keep the inside of the body the same, okay, despite what's going on the outside, okay? So there are literally thousands of examples of homeostasis, but some common ones that we tend to talk about a lot are blood pH, so we're talking about somewhere in this range, slightly basic, carbon dioxide concentration, glucose concentration, body temperature, your osmotic balance, so lots of things involved with keeping your internal environment regulated and stable. Now, when we think of homeostasis, okay, we often tend to think of these negative feedback loops, okay? And so negative feedback loops are processes that are going to bring something back towards a middle value, towards a set point, okay? So let's consider the example of body temperature. Your body is supposed to be 37 degrees. If your body temperature falls below 37 degrees, then the hypothalamus, this section here of your brain, is going to send a message along a motor neuron. That motor neuron is going to cause one of your muscles to shiver. Shivering uses ATP, okay, which we generate through cellular respiration. And we know that cellular respiration produces a couple of things, but one of which is heat. So that shivering is then going to bring your temperatures back to that middle value, that 37 degrees. If your temperatures go up too much, okay, you might do something like sweating, and then that's going to bring your temperature back down. So these are what we call negative feedback loops, things that always end with bringing a value back to a set point. Now, homeostasis can be achieved in a variety of ways. We just talked about a physical one like shivering, but it can also be through the production of hormones. And hormones originate in our endocrine system. Okay, so your endocrine system is a series of glands that are going to produce hormones, and hormones circulate in the bloodstream. So they literally go everywhere throughout your entire body. Okay, how do they only elicit a specific response? Well, that's because they only will affect target tissues. And again, this all has to do with your brain, right? So you have some sensory neurons sending messages to the brain. The brain's going to interpret that message, and then the brain is going to send an endocrine gland or a message to an endocrine gland to release some hormones, okay? So if we have a message from somewhere in our body that says, I'm in need of a specific thing or I'm having a specific problem, okay, a sensory neuron will carry that message to the brain. The brain will then send that message to a particular gland. That gland will secrete a hormone all over the body through the bloodstream. Okay, it'll also end up at the target tissue to perform that response. All right, so let's take a look at some of these endocrine glands in your body and go ahead and label them. Let's start with probably the easiest one. So I'm going to look at these two glands, these white glands sitting on top of the kidneys. These are our adrenal glands. Okay, they produce adrenaline or epinephrine. And this guy, of course, you know from our study on the digestive system, this is the pancreas. So the pancreas does double duty. It secretes digestive enzymes through exocrine glands, those go through a duct, but it also secretes hormones because it has endocrine glands or cells as well. Okay, so in this chest area here, we have the thymus gland and the thyroid gland. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that later. This thyroid gland is super important. It's like this butterfly-shaped gland right here in your neck, and sitting kind of right on top of it is something called the parathyroid. And then let's get to your brain. In your brain, you're going to have a very small gland here in the back called the pineal gland. A little bit closer to the midsection here is the hypothalamus. We know that guy. And then the pituitary gland. Okay, we're going to talk a lot more about the pituitary later on in this chapter. We're also going to talk later on in this chapter about some of our reproductive organs. So here we have some strange mashup of male and female. Okay, if this were a female, these small almond-shaped organs here in the abdominal cavity are the ovaries. Okay, and the ovaries are going to be found in females only. And then in males, we would have the testes. So the testes and the ovaries, again, kind of like the pancreas, do a variety of jobs, okay? But one of those jobs is to secrete hormones. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these hormones. A hormone can be either a lipid, and I missed this on my typing, a lipid or protein-based molecule that's secreted into the bloodstream, and that's really important. Okay, so hormones always go into the bloodstream, and that again means that they travel throughout the entire body. So even if you have a hormone that's only affecting one particular area, that hormone is in the whole body. Okay, so how does that work? Well, it only affects targeted tissues. So let's consider this picture. Here we've got some kind of a cell in some kind of endocrine gland, okay? And it's going to secrete this hormone that then travels through the bloodstream. It's going to come in contact with lots of different tissues, but only the target tissues are going to have a receptor to bind with that hormone. Okay, so that's kind of one of the ways that hormones target specific cells. Okay, it's through this receptor that fits the shape of that hormone. And again, those can either be lipids or proteins. Some of the common hormones in your body are things that we just take for granted, right? So let's start with this hormone called thyroxin. Thyroxin is produced by the thyroid gland. Okay, remember that's this one right here in your neck area. And your thyroid gland is incredibly important for controlling both your metabolism and your body temperature. Okay, so this is a common problem seen in many individuals, either having too much or too little of this thyroxin. And we call that syndrome either hyperthyroidism if they produce too much, or hypothyroidism if they produce too little. So someone that's producing too much thyroxin is going to have a very much increased metabolism. So they're going to be burning calories like crazy. They're going to have trouble maintaining a normal weight, and they're going to have trouble maintaining a proper body temperature. Someone with hypothyroidism is going to have a decreased metabolism. So we're looking at unexplained weight gain, feeling rather tired. Again, not because there's something good you want to watch on Netflix and you eat a gallon of ice cream, but literally you're not eating anymore. There's no explanation for the weight gain, and you're very tired. So one of the things that your doctor will usually do is do a blood test and check the levels of thyroxin in your blood. Now, interestingly enough, one of the things that your thyroid needs for healthy function is iodine. If you don't have enough iodine in your diet, you can develop a problem with your thyroid, leading to what we call a goiter, this huge inflamed swollen thyroid. So one of the things that we do to make sure we get enough iodine is we actually iodize our salt. We add small amounts of iodine to salt, and just that little bit helps to prevent these things here. So that's why we see this iodized thing on our salt containers. All right, so leptin is another hormone that we've talked about before, but leptin is kind of cool. It's secreted by the adipose tissue, also known as fat tissue in your body. So kind of not in a specific location, but just anywhere we have this fat tissue. And its function is to decrease appetite. So again, another example of a negative feedback loop here. When you have a lot of fat, you're eating too much, okay? So when you have all this fat, the levels of leptin go up because this fat is producing a lot of leptin. That tells your brain, hey, I'm kind of fat, I don't need to eat as much. So your brain is then supposed to decrease your appetite. When you decrease your appetite, the level of fat in your body should go down, okay? And we should be returning back to those stable levels. Sometimes some people can become desensitized to leptin. So leptin is a good message for your brain, but there are lots of other messages that are telling our brain, that McDonald's looks good, or I really want those potato chips, okay? And so your brain is getting a lot more messages than just this leptin. So either these messages can be overridden, or we can just become desensitized, and then it doesn't work in terms of controlling our appetite anymore. And so we're currently doing a lot of studies to see if there's some kind of a genetic link or what have you to people that are prone to obesity and how their bodies are responding to this leptin. Okay, our next example here is melatonin. And melatonin is secreted by the pineal gland, this super small gland tucked deep within your brain. And its function is to regulate our day-night cycle, also known as our circadian rhythm. Okay, and so what our pineal gland does is in the nighttime, okay, when there's not daylight hours, it increases the melatonin levels. Those melatonin levels help us to fall asleep, and we secrete less melatonin during the day so that we're not so sleepy. So some people that are having trouble falling asleep will sometimes take melatonin, but you really shouldn't need to if you have a properly functioning pineal gland. Really, melatonin is most helpful to prevent things like jet lag. So when you fly through so many time zones, okay, you're kind of tricking your body because it may be light where you end up, but it's not in your normal day-night cycle. So your body is still producing melatonin during your usual sleep hours, but unfortunately you're in a new time zone, so it's not sleepy time anymore. So taking melatonin pills whenever you get to your destination and it's nighttime there can kind of help give your body a head start on regulating that day-night sleep cycle. Okay, now let's go back and talk about the pancreas. This is some interesting stuff here because the pancreas is both an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. So when we say exocrine, it's secreting a specific secretion through a duct to a very specific location. So it helps a lot in digestion that way. It's got these exocrine cells, okay, that are making things like not salivary amylase, pancreatic amylase, trypsin, lipase. So all of those are made by these exocrine cells and then secreted through a duct, okay? So exocrine stuff goes to a very specific and particular location. But it's also an endocrine gland because it secretes hormones that are going into the bloodstream. So those cells are going to be around the periphery, okay, and they're going to be secreting stuff that's going into the blood. And then the blood is going to go everywhere, and that hormone is going to be picked up by those target tissues. There are two hormones that you need to know, okay, that are produced by the pancreas. One of those is insulin, and insulin is going to be secreted by beta cells, which you may see too written like that, like a bee with a fancy tail, and glucagon. So glucagon is produced by alpha cells, and you may see it written like that. So here's kind of a different view of the pancreas across sections. So taking a section like this, I'm going to see those exocrine cells, and I know these are exocrine cells because they have a duct. Okay, so those are secreting those digestive juices. The endocrine glands are all in here in this region, and there's a few that are here that you don't need to know, but these beta and alpha cells you definitely need to know. So beta producing insulin, alpha cells producing glucagon. Now, it's really important that those glucose levels are maintained at a homeostatic level, and that's because glucose can mess with the osmolarity of our red blood cells. So glucose is soluble in the blood plasma, this area outside of the cell. Within our blood cells, there's also a certain concentration of glucose. We need those to be the same. We need those to be isotonic. That way there's no net movement of water into or out of the cells. If there is too much glucose in our blood plasma compared to the cell, then our blood plasma becomes hypertonic, okay? And that glucose forces water to move out of the cell via osmosis. And so this red blood cell is going to shrivel up and it's not effective anymore. If our blood glucose levels drop, our plasma has very little glucose in it compared to the cell, then this becomes a hypotonic blood plasma situation. The lack of concentration of glucose in the blood plasma causes excess water from the plasma to enter the cell via osmosis, and this could cause so much water to enter here that that blood cell could pop. So we really want to make sure that our blood glucose, and when we say that, we mean the concentration in the plasma, remains isotonic or the same to the concentration within that blood cell. All right, so let's talk a little bit about where that glucose comes from and why those glucose levels fluctuate throughout the day. Okay, so first of all, we need to understand where this glucose is coming from. Okay, they're absorbed in the small intestine. Okay, and of course, we know that things like the villi and microvilli help facilitate this. Okay, this is really going to start with some enzymes. So remember, we're probably going to get glucose in some ways from the breakdown of starch. Starch is broken down by amylase into maltose. Okay, and then that maltose is further broken down into glucose. From the small intestine, that blood is going to flow to the liver. Okay, and then that blood is regulated by the liver. So if that blood contains really low amounts of glucose, the liver needs to put some glucose into that blood. If the blood contains way too much glucose, the liver needs to take some out. So we've already talked about that previously with the liver. Now, let's say you're a cell that's part of a tissue that is suddenly increasing the rate of respiration. So maybe they're exercising or something like that. They're going to need more glucose. And that glucose is going to come from the breakdown of glycogen. Okay, so remember, glycogen is that branched polysaccharide made up of, could be thousands of molecules of glucose. When we break up that glycogen, okay, then those blood glucose levels are going to go back up because we've taken all the glucoses and broken them up and then released them into the blood. Now, all of this is regulated by the two hormones produced by the pancreas, insulin and glucagon. Okay, so let's talk insulin first. Remember, this comes from those beta cells of the pancreas, and this is going to cause the liver to absorb the glucose. Okay, so that means that it's removing it from the blood, and therefore my blood glucose levels should go down. So you've probably heard of this before. People with diabetes have high blood sugar. Okay, they inject insulin to bring their blood glucose levels down. Well, that's because insulin tells the liver to absorb the glucose and turn it into glycogen and store it. And the way that this really works is really kind of fascinating. Okay, here are some cells, okay, and they're going to have a glucose channel. That allows glucose to go into the cell, but it's normally closed. So insulin also will have a binding site on those cells. And when insulin binds at that binding site, it causes the glucose channel to open. So then glucose can enter into that cell. Okay, but that can only be facilitated if we have insulin there to bind with it. So this is kind of on the cellular level how insulin helps lower that blood sugar level. Now, glucagon, which again is released by those alpha cells of the pancreas, does the exact opposite. Okay, this is going to happen when your blood glucose levels are already really low. Okay, so glucagon needs to function to bring them back up. Okay, that's what it's trying to do. And it does that by stimulating the liver cells to take some of the glycogen that they have in store, cut it into glucose, and release it into the blood. Okay, so that causes our blood glucose levels to go up. So I always remember that by saying when all your glucose is gone, you secrete glucagon. Okay, and again, glucagon is going to cause those glycogen molecules to be broken up into individual glucoses, which would cause your blood glucose level to go up. Now, if you have a problem with this glucose and insulin mechanism, okay, you can be suffering from one of two types of what we call diabetes. And the two types are actually very different. So in type 1 diabetes, we often call it juvenile onset or juvenile diabetes. Okay, and then this is when the beta cells are malfunctioning. They don't produce enough insulin. So there's a problem with the actual beta cells. Okay, this we can control by insulin injections. So if our beta cells aren't working, we can just do their job for them by injecting insulin into our bloodstream. This really represents a very small portion of diabetes cases, okay? So what's happening here is it's an autoimmune disease. The body is attacking its own beta cells, okay? There is nothing that these people can do about this. This is quite different than type 2 diabetes. So this is very much a result of lifestyle choices, okay? And we often call it adult onset diabetes. So this is when those insulin receptors that we talked about earlier, okay, this is when they're not responding properly to insulin. So if they're not responding properly and they're not letting insulin bind, then those glucose channels are going to remain closed. We can't take in any insulin into the cell, and that means all of the we can't take any glucose into the cell, and that means all of our glucose is going to remain in our bloodstream. This is largely a result of poor choices in diet and exercise, and represents the majority of diabetes cases. So again, there can be a genetic component. There are also strong correlations to age and ethnicity, but most of this comes from the fact that we have just constantly bombarded ourselves with glucose and insulin, and they're just really not listening anymore. Now, regardless of the type of diabetes, if you leave it untreated, it can cause some really crazy, gnarly problems, including blindness, kidney failure, nerve damage, problems healing wounds, okay, increased risks of heart disease, okay, lots of terrible consequences here from diabetes. Okay, so we're kind of done with the homeostasis portion. Okay, let's move on to some of that reproduction portion. All right, so the fun stuff, right? Let's talk about some of the hormones involved in reproduction. And we're going to start out with the guys here. Okay, so the major sex hormone in males is testosterone. And testosterone is really kind of a fascinating hormone because it does different things at different points in a male's life. Okay, so during embryonic development, it helps to develop male genitalia. Okay, during puberty, we're going to see that same hormone, testosterone, develop secondary sex characteristics. So body hair, okay, deepening voice, increased muscle mass, etc. And then in adulthood, okay, we're going to see testosterone be the main cause of this sex drive and of sperm production. Okay, so kind of cool that one hormone can do different things throughout a man's lifetime. All right, so let's continue our discussion of the male reproduction by drawing the male reproductive system. And we're going to go back and annotate this a little bit later. Okay, so I usually start off with the abdomen. Here's the penis. Okay, and then after the penis, we have the scrotum, and then that's all we really need for the outside view right now. So we're going to be drawing a side view. So we're looking at a man's penis from a side view. Okay, and we're really the most concerned with what's happening on the inside. Okay, so inside of the scrotum is a testy, okay, or testis, and that's where the sperm is going to be produced. The sperm matures in this little bit of tissue called the epididymis. And then the sperm is going to travel on this crazy roller coaster ride through a tube called the vas deferens. Okay, now the vas deferens is on this crazy trajectory because it has to get around the urinary bladder. Okay, now men are pretty unique, okay, because they have one out tube, okay, it's called the urethra. We'll draw that in just a moment, okay, but that tube can carry, sometimes it can carry urine, and other times it can carry sperm. So we have some junctions that we need to draw in here. We have a gland right here, kind of on the back side of the urinary bladder, and that gland is called the seminal vesicle. It's going to add some secretions, okay, and then the vas deferens continues, and it's going to pick up some secretions from the prostate. Okay, so we're going to have like a merging of tubes here, if I can get this to work. There we go. Hopefully yours looks a little bit more smooth and continuous than mine. Okay, so sperm is traveling from the epididymis through the vas deferens. It picks up stuff from the seminal vesicle. It continues. It picks up stuff from the prostate. It continues. Okay, if nothing is going on here ejaculation-wise, maybe this tube can be used for urine, so it might pick up something from the urinary bladder, and then it's going to make its way out of the penis through the urethra. Okay, so that urethra is the opening or tube in the penis. Urethra. Here's the penis. We're not really all that concerned with the erectile tissue and all that other stuff going on with the penis. Okay, just pretty much the tubey parts. Okay, this sac that the testes sit in is called the scrotum, but again, we're more concerned with internal anatomy. This is the testis, that's singular, testes plural. This sperm maturation, like sperm nursery, again, is called the epididymis. Okay, and then that tube leading away from the epididymis is called the vas deferens. If you get a vasectomy, okay, you are literally snipping or tying that tube, making that journey impossible. Okay, the gland on the backside of the bladder that the vas deferens encounters first is called the seminal vesicle. Okay, then we have the prostate. Okay, and then this, of course, doesn't have anything to do with reproduction, but we'll label it anyways because it's there and we share tubes with it. Well, not we, I'm not a man, but men share tubes with it. And that is, of course, the urinary bladder. Okay, so now that we have this labeled, let's work on annotating with functions. Okay, so here's what I was trying to draw here in side view. Of course, this is a mirror image. So here's the urethra, okay? Here's that urinary bladder. So if we're not having an ejaculation, maybe we're using that for urine. Here's the testes, the epididymis, the vas deferens going around, okay? It gets secretions from the seminal vesicle. Then it's going to pick up secretions from the prostate. Then it's on its way out the penis. And of course, if we're looking at a side view, we would have an anus and all other kinds of crazy fun things. All right, so when we think of testis, we need to think of sperm production, okay? But they're kind of lame and they don't do what they're supposed to do yet. They need to grow up a little bit. They're going to mature in the epididymis. The scrotum, okay, so I forgot to label that on the other slide. Okay, Mel, make sure you go back and do that. So make sure you add this label to your notes. Okay, the scrotum is really important because it's this sac, okay, down here. And what it does is it allows the testes to kind of descend out of the body. Sperm needs to be at a lower temperature than the body temperature. So the fact that that scrotum kind of hangs down like some really bad Christmas ornament is going to allow that to kind of be at a cooler temperature. All right, then we've got our vas deferens. That's the tube that's carrying mature sperm out the urethra during an ejaculation. The seminal vesicle is going to add seminal fluid, okay? So it's going to make this a little bit more of a fluid than just like little sperm on their own. The prostate is going to add some more fluid that's particularly high in carbohydrates, so literally full of sugar. And these are for the sperm. The sperm have a long way to swim, and they got a really hard job to do, and they're going to need carbohydrates. Okay, so that's added by the prostate. The penis is there to become erect and allow for intercourse. So it's full of holy or cavernous tissue that can literally fill with blood and make it rigid. Okay, and it's also the organ from which sperm is ejected during an ejaculation. And then we've got the urethra, and that's this tube that carries the sperm out of the penis. It also carries urine, but we don't really care about that right now because that's boring. Okay, so when it comes to drawing the male, it's easier to do a side view. For females, okay, I really prefer to do a front view. I think it's a little bit easier just because of the symmetry. Okay, so I usually start with kind of a triangle. I'm going to leave the corners open. Okay, I promise this is a real thing. Okay, so that triangle is really forming the body of the uterus. Okay. Extending from the uterus, like some horns on some wonderful cow, okay, are the fallopian tubes. And those fallopian tubes kind of have these like finger-like projections at the end. So this is really looking like some kind of antelope, but that's okay. Okay, and those are going to end up connecting to the ovaries. Okay, so like there's little earrings hanging off of our cow's horns. Okay, now this uterus is going to end up in the vaginal canal. So this is the interior of the female reproductive system, not the exterior, okay, but the interior. So this canal here is the vagina, okay? It is a muscular canal. It can expand during childbirth, etc. Okay, and all of this is made up of a muscle. So the vagina is a muscle, and it's going to narrow to a very, very small opening here, okay, at a spot called the cervix. Okay, so there's a cervix. We'll talk more about that later. Okay, and then this muscular layer is going to continue to form the wall of the uterus. There we go. Okay, so all of this is the muscular uterus wall. Okay. All right, now we would generally call the inside of this the uterus, okay, but I'm assuming you don't need to do that. If you know that this is the uterus and this is the uterine wall, okay, that's really great. Now, the inside of the uterine wall is lined with a vascular bloody tissue, okay. It can be thicker at some points of the month than others, and it's shed once a month during menstruation. And this is called the endometrium. Okay, so again, okay, these fallopian tubes or oviducts, I would know both words, okay? Fallopian tube, also known as oviduct, okay, are going to carry eggs from the ovary into the uterus. Okay, so as we get more like in tune with what's going on here, okay, I'll just give you a little hint here. This egg is going to be released from the ovary. Okay, meanwhile, sperm is going to swim up through the vagina, through the uterus, through the fallopian tube, and where egg and sperm meets, that's where fertilization occurs. The fertilized embryo is then going to take its sweet time getting down here to the uterus, and it's going to implant in the endometrium, and then this is where the baby develops. Okay, so let's go ahead and label, okay, or I shouldn't say label, annotate the labels we already have with their functions. Okay, so these ovaries, women have 2 of them, and they do a few things. So we know that they release the eggs, but that's not on this list. That's because when I say eggs, we have a fancy word for it. Okay, this is an oocyte. We'll talk more about that later. Ovaries are also the site of estrogen production. And this is also where we're going to see the development of something called a corpus luteum. So you should probably just note that for now, and we'll talk more about what that is later. It's not as scary as it sounds. Okay, so then we have the fallopian tube, also known as the oviduct, and that's going to carry, okay, things from the ovary to the uterus. Okay. Our uterus is this muscular organ here. So I just pointed to the opening, but you can see how muscular the walls are. Okay, this is where the embryo is implanted if pregnancy occurs and where the baby would develop. And the fact that it's a muscle is great because that means it can expand. And then when the baby's ready to be born, contract and squeeze that little sucker out. All right, so let's move on to the endometrium. This is the lining of the uterus here, highly vascular, lots of blood vessels. We've got the cervix. The cervix is this really narrow opening here between the vagina and the uterus. So this is kind of going to allow sperm to enter. It can expand when a child is being ready to be born. So when you say that a woman is like 2 centimeters dilated or 10 centimeters dilated, they're talking about the dilation or expansion of that cervix. Okay, and then last but not least, we have the vagina. Okay, and the vagina is this muscular canal leading out of the body. So this is going to be the place where sperm is going to enter or where a baby is going to exit. Probably not at the same time. Okay, so let's talk about what makes someone biologically male or female. Okay, so the sex chromosomes of a female are going to be XX. Okay, so we have 22 pairs of what we call autosomes, like normal chromosomes that have genes for like blood type, hair color, nose shape, etc. And then our last pair, okay, is our sex chromosomes. And so if you inherit 2 X chromosomes, you are biologically female. If you inherit 1 X chromosome and 1 Y, you are biologically male. Okay, and all of that is determined by the father. So if we look at a Punnett square, okay, a woman can pass along an X or an X because she's got 2 X chromosomes. A male can either pass along an X or a Y. So every child is going to inherit an X chromosome from their mother. Whichever one they get from their father is going to determine whether they're a female or a male. Okay, so what does this matter whether you have X or Y chromosomes? Well, because the X or Y chromosomes result in the development of male or female characteristics during embryonic development. So at about 8 weeks, if there are 2 X chromosomes present, then that growing ball of cells is going to start to present or produce female hormones, which are going to result in female development. If there's a Y chromosome present, then that ball of cells is going to produce testosterone. Okay, and so depending on what kind of hormone is being produced, that's going to determine the gender or the type of reproductive organs that that embryo is going to develop. All right, so let's take a little closer look at these sex hormones. And I want to talk about testosterone. So again, that's testosterone in males. And I just want to focus in on what's going on in puberty, because we just talked about embryonic development. In adults, we already know it deals with sex drive and sperm production. So let's focus just in on puberty. So testosterone is going to cause the growth of facial hair, underarm hair, isn't that lovely? Chest hair, pubic hair, so lots of hair. Okay, it's going to deepen the voice. It's going to increase the muscle mass, and it's going to cause the enlargement of the penis. So again, all of that is testosterone during puberty. Females, on the other hand, okay, during puberty are mainly under the influences of estrogen and progesterone. And so that's going to cause the enlargement of the breast tissue, the growth of pubic hair, okay, the growth of underarm hair, and the widening of the hips. So you're going to notice that as women go through puberty, their hips become wider. That's because they're getting ready for childbirth, okay, and need to develop a larger pelvic area to facilitate the birthing process. All right, so as we get into the menstrual cycle, okay, just a little kind of fun fact here, they're usually lasting around 28 days, and that happens to be the same length as the lunar cycle. And there's lots of historical and evolutionary significant things that happen in regards to the menstrual cycle in terms of like treatment of women in different cultures and different traditions. Lots of crazy things to look into. You can look that up on your own, but it's definitely worth a good read. Now, when we say menstrual cycle, okay, most people think of menstruating or bleeding, okay? And when we have a menstrual cycle, what we're really seeing exiting out of the vagina is the shedding of that endometrium, okay? So remember, the uterus is lined by a highly vascular lining, that endometrium. This is where the fertilized egg or embryo should be implanting. Okay, that is only there to help you get ready for pregnancy. But if there is no pregnancy, the woman must shed this lining and then prepare a new one for the next cycle. So basically, this is like your body's way of like punishing you for not getting pregnant, okay? You got to get rid of this endometrial lining and then start all over again. Okay, so before we get into anything crazy here with more of these hormones, let's just do a quick review of the location of a couple of glands. So we're interested in the hypothalamus and then the pituitary gland. Well, over here, way deep down in your brain is this little thing that kind of like looks like testicles, but it's not. That's your pituitary gland, okay? And we have the anterior pituitary and the posterior. So how are you supposed to tell them apart? Well, posterior is nearest to your butt end, okay? Anterior is nearest to your face end, okay? So if I'm looking at this person, okay, here would be their nose and mouth and whatever, okay? Because the pituitary gland, the anterior portion is closer to the front and the posterior closer to the back. They're both kind of hanging on to the hypothalamus, okay? Now, the glands that are going to be produced here are going to, not glands, the hormones that are produced in those glands are going to have some interactions with some hormones produced by the ovary, okay? So just keep in mind that there is an interaction here and that hormones always circulate, I swear that says hormones, always circulate throughout the blood. Okay, so when we say that messages are traveling back and forth, they're doing so through the bloodstream. Okay, so here are some hormones that you need to know. All right, we have something called GnRH, okay, and this stands for gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay, this is going to trigger the release of other hormones. We also have LH, or luteinizing hormones. Talk more about these later. And then we have FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, so let's take a look at how these hormones all interact. All right, and I'm going to start off with the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamus is going to produce a hormone that tells the anterior pituitary what to do, okay? And this bossy hormone is called GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, okay? And so it tells the anterior pituitary to produce one of two hormones. These hormones are LH, the luteinizing hormone, or FSH, okay, the follicle stimulating hormone. Both of these hormones act on the ovaries, okay, and they tell the ovaries to release hormones of their own. And these hormones are called estrogen and progesterone. Okay, and estrogen and progesterone both act on the endometrium. Okay, so they can affect how thick that endometrium lining is. Okay, so again, the hypothalamus produces GnRH. GnRH tells the anterior pituitary to produce LH or FSH. Those hormones tell the ovaries to produce estrogen and progesterone, which act on the endometrium. Okay, now LH and FSH have several effects, okay? We'll talk more a little bit more about that in a bit. Okay, but one of them is to trigger the follicle cells that are in the ovary to start secreting estrogen, okay? And when I say a follicle, I mean the structure surrounding an oocyte or an egg, okay? So if we're looking at that down here, okay, these developing oocytes, okay, are going to have this structure surrounding them called a follicle, okay? And so that follicle begins to thicken and develop based on these hormones FSH and LH. We then start to get the development of estrogen. Okay, so this developing follicle here is going to start secreting estrogen. And estrogen has a couple of effects on its own. One of which is to thicken the endometrium, so to cause that lining to really thicken and become vascular, get ready for pregnancy. The other thing that it does is it tells the anterior pituitary to release more FSH and LH. Okay, so wait a minute. More FSH and LH caused the production of more estrogen because it's coming from that follicle. More estrogen causes even more FSH and LH. So here's an example of a positive feedback loop. Okay, and that's going to be important as we talk about these hormonal interactions in possible pregnancies. Okay, so let's begin to take a closer look at how these eggs and follicles develop throughout a menstrual cycle and how they affect the hormones as part of the female reproductive system. Okay, so the first thing we're going to notice is this small immature egg that's present in the ovaries called an oocyte. Women have thousands of oocytes that they're born with. Okay, and every month, one lucky winner is chosen to move on through the cycle. Okay, the FSH and LH are going to cause the development of the follicle. Okay, and that follicle is called the Graafian follicle. It's this ring of cells that surrounds the developing oocyte. So here's the developing oocyte or egg. Okay, and around it, FSH and LH are causing the development of the follicle. That follicle produces estrogen, which causes the pituitary to secrete even more FSH and LH, okay? And then we know these in turn will cause this follicle to develop more estrogen, more of these, okay? Kind of a runaway positive feedback loop. This big spike in the levels of FSH and LH are going to cause the Graafian follicle to basically eject the egg into the fallopian tube. So notice that the Graafian follicle itself stays behind. It doesn't get to leave the ovary, but it takes this egg and it ejects it into the fallopian tube. And this is what we call ovulation. The leftover cells from that Graafian follicle, now that they don't have an egg in them, they're going to become a structure called the corpus luteum, literally meaning empty body. Okay, this corpus luteum is in turn going to start to produce a hormone of its own, and this hormone is called progesterone. Progesterone causes the thickening of the endometrium. The combination of progesterone and estrogen, okay, so we had estrogen from the follicle, we had progesterone from the corpus luteum. This combination inhibits or stops the production of GnRH. Okay, so remember GnRH is going to trigger the anterior pituitary to produce LH and FSH and all those other things, okay? But this combination tells it to stop doing that so that a follicle doesn't develop. Basically, what we're saying here is that, hello, we just ovulated. We don't want to start developing another follicle right away. Now, everything that happens next depends on if a pregnancy occurs. Okay, so if that egg is fertilized by a sperm, a whole nother ball of wax happens, okay? If no pregnancy occurs, which is where we're going to take our discussion, then this corpus luteum here is going to start to break down and degenerate. Because the corpus luteum is what was producing progesterone, if I don't have a corpus luteum, then I'm not going to have any more progesterone. Progesterone was what was causing that endometrial lining to stay so thick. So if I stop the progesterone, I'm not going to have anything to maintain that lining, and I'm going to shed that lining during menstruation. Okay? So now I have no follicle, I have no corpus luteum, so I have no progesterone or estrogen, okay? And these were the things that were inhibiting the GnRH. Well, if they're both gone, that tells GnRH, okay, you go ahead and tell that anterior pituitary to start producing FSH and LH again, and then we can start a new cycle. Okay, so let's summarize the functions of the hormones that we talked about so far. So, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are going to cause the development of the follicle, and they're going to cause ovulation when they're both spiking. Estrogen causes the endometrium to increase, and alone it can stimulate more FSH and LH, but again, that's if it's by itself. Progesterone has to do with the endometrium, and together with estrogen can inhibit GnRH. So how do birth control pills work? Well, hormonal birth control pills, like the traditional ones seen in this packet, contain both estrogen and progesterone. Remember that together, those two inhibit GnRH. GnRH, if it's not there, can't help secrete or tell the anterior pituitary to secrete FSH and LH. So without this, I don't have these, and I can't develop a follicle. Okay, so if I don't develop a follicle, I'm not going to ovulate, and there will be no egg released. If you miss a pill, okay, then your body can sense that you don't have these anymore, and it will all of a sudden start to produce GnRH, which will trigger LH and FSH, which will trigger follicle development and ovulation. Okay, so you have to make sure you take those on time. Now, 7 of the 28 pills contain a whole lot of nothing, okay? So this is going to mean that I don't have these estrogen and progesterone anymore, and when those levels drop, that causes the shedding of the endometrium, and this is the week where you have your period. Unless you're a boy, and then you should watch out, because this is the week you should be buying someone flowers or something. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to track how several different things change throughout the cycle, okay, over the course of an entire 28 days or one whole cycle. So we're going to be tracking a few things, okay. Down here on the bottom, I'm going to track the endometrium thickness, okay. I'm also going to track the two steroid hormones that help contribute to that, which are estrogen and progesterone. Okay, and if you see estrogen spelled with an O in front of it, don't freak out. That's just the British spelling, estrogen. It sounds fancier, I suppose. Okay, I'm going to track some crazy things happening in the ovary, particularly where it comes to the follicle and such. Okay, and here I'm going to track LH and FSH. Okay, so LH and FSH, they can go together since they're both coming from the anterior pituitary. Okay, and we're going to start with those two. Okay, so very, very slowly throughout these 14 days, that FSH and LH is going to start to rise, okay? And as that happens, okay, the follicle is going to start to develop, okay? So if you need to make a note to yourself that this is a follicle, you just go ahead and do that, okay? Good for you. Okay, now remember that this follicle then starts to produce estrogen, okay, and estrogen is going to be on the rise also. Estrogen, okay, which is coming from this follicle, is going to cause even more FSH and LH to be produced. So at about day 14, okay, FSH and LH are both going to spike, okay? This, again, is going to correspond with the further development of the follicle and even more estrogen. Now, when we get this spike in FSH and LH, this is going to cause the ovule, okay, or the egg, which has been developing inside that follicle, to come out, okay? And so here is ovulation. Ovulation happens on day 14. Okay, after ovulation, we're going to get the development of the corpus luteum. Okay? All right. So, without the follicle anymore, because now it's not a follicle, it's a corpus luteum. Without the follicle anymore, these estrogen levels are going to go back down. On the other hand, now that I have this corpus luteum, I'm going to start getting the development of progesterone. Okay, so progesterone has been pretty low this whole time. It's going to start, okay, coming about when I get this corpus luteum. Okay, now remember, when I've got estrogen and progesterone together, that inhibits these guys. Okay, so FSH and LH are going to go down. Now, what's happening with the menstrual or endometrium thickness at this time? Well, okay, it's pretty low. Okay, there's not a whole lot going on until we see a rise in estrogen. And a rise in estrogen is going to cause an increase, okay, in the endometrial thickness lining. But it's really not going to peak until we get progesterone. That progesterone comes from the corpus luteum. Okay, so the more progesterone I have, the more thick my lining is. So that's really going to get very thick. And around 28 days, okay, or the peak of my progesterone, okay, what's going to happen is that this corpus luteum is going to break down, okay? My progesterone levels are going to fall, so maybe that doesn't happen quite like that, okay, something like this, okay? And that means I'm going to shed my endometrial lining. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that. Okay, and that's how our menstrual cycle works, okay, with our crazy amount of interacting hormones. Okay, so if my crazy lines weren't enough for you, okay, here's exactly what we just talked about, okay? So we should be getting a peak in LH and FSH at around day 14, okay, when ovulation occurs. It also corresponds with the peak in estrogen. That makes sense because this follicle is producing the estrogen. The follicle develops because of these guys, so the more of these guys, the more follicle, the more follicle, the more estrogen. Okay, that peak causes ovulation, okay? And then since this Graafian follicle isn't around to produce estrogen anymore, those levels drop. Progesterone levels start to rise when we get the corpus luteum, okay? And that, of course, causes an increase in the endometrial lining, okay? And then at the end of this, okay, when these progesterone levels fall, we're going to shed all of this during menstruation. Okay. So if you're really kind of in tune with what's going on, you should be able to outline, so step-by-step procedure, the events of the menstrual cycle. So I'm going to encourage you to use your graph that you just made to practice doing that. Might be a good idea to pause here and take some time to see if you can get those steps done. And here would be the mark scheme for something like that. Okay, so just take some time to look through this, see if you're getting this, if this is making sense for you with all of these hormonal interactions. Okay, in the last part of this video, I want to talk to you about something called IVF, in vitro fertilization. Okay, so this is kind of a last resort, if you will, fertility treatment. So let's talk about normal conception and implementation first. So after ovulation, okay, we get fertilization by the sperm in the fallopian tube, usually about 1 to 2 days after ovulation. So you have to time ovulation with intercourse there. This zygote, this fertilized egg, is going to divide many times, and that's all happening in this fallopian tube, okay? So this ball of cells, this embryo, is going to implant in that endometrial lining, and here this is where we're going to see the development of that embryo, placenta, all the things involved with pregnancy. Some couples have a variety of problems with infertility, and this can be on the part of the female, on the part of the male. It could involve a low sperm count. It can involve impotence, like the inability to sustain an erection for intercourse. Females don't always ovulate normally. You saw how crazy that hormonal interaction was. No wonder sometimes we don't get it right. Or we could have blocked fallopian tubes. So anything with like cysts or scar tissues or those other things, there's a whole bunch of reasons why couples can have trouble having children. So IVF is often used to help people with with fertility problems. And so you may have seen a video recently about a German woman in her 60s who was able to have a successful pregnancy through IVF. Well, she's not the only one. There are a lot of people that use this, okay? And here's basically how it works. First, you have to give hormonal shots to the woman to stop the secretion of her own hormones. So we want to be able to control what's going on. Then they fill her up with a whole crap load of FSH, and that's going to cause a lot of these Graafian follicles to develop. They then stick an ultrasound wand up through the vagina so they can see what they're doing, and then extend a needle into the ovary and suck out some of those eggs. Okay, so first, again, we're really trying to harvest these eggs here. Okay, once they have the egg, they got to get the sperm. So a man is going to ejaculate into a container, okay, and we're going to mix that sperm with the eggs that we harvested. we're going to allow those embryos to develop into a petri dish. So we're going to allow that zygote to multiply until it's a ball of, let's say, about 100 cells. One of the things that we can do, it's optional, is we can screen all of those embryos for diseases, okay, or conditions, or even gender. And then we're going to take one or maybe more of those embryos and basically stick them in the uterus of the woman, and then that pregnancy proceeds normally as if it would have gone the traditional route. Okay, so basically we just did everything that normally happens in the fallopian tubes in a petri dish, and then we stuck that fertilized egg, that embryo, back in the uterus. Okay, so in vitro is pretty dang amazing. The science behind it is incredible. There are some ethical considerations in terms of what do we do with the leftover embryos, okay? Do we kill them? Is that killing a living thing? Do we implant them all, like all 8 of them, let's say, and then put those fetuses under a great amount of stress? Multiples tend to have quite a bit amount of stress. Or what if we decide that we want a particular girl or a particular gender? Can we screen the embryos and then just decide which one to put in? So the science behind in vitro fertilization is much farther ahead than our laws or even our own understanding of the ethics of this. So lots of things to consider, but all of which you need a knowledge for, and I hope you got that here in this last chapter, in chapter 6, and that'll do it for hormones, homeostasis, and reproduction.